tape recorder. And let's pray. Let me ask the Lord to watch over our time together. That is our prayer, Father, that you would please watch over our time, our technology, and just pray your peace, your direction, your blessing on each of us trying to do your work in the various parts of your world. Lord, it's just we want to do all things for your honor and in a way that accomplishes your purposes. And it's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, we're going to look at research methodology today. I want to ask, let me share my screen a second. I just want to say a couple words. Melissa and I were kind of emailing back and forth on the plagiarism checker, which I still have problems with the particular one that we have on Populi at times. But let's see, what do I want to do here? Come over here. Oh, there you go. Oh, I see. Okay. Well, something's happening with my computer. It's not allowing me to move my screen like I want to. I'm going to stop sharing. Let me share one more time. What if I share that screen? See what that does. Huh, interesting. Well, can you actually see a part of that, the Populi screen? Let me ask you, when you look at a student screen, do you have these different plagiarism percentages that show up when you go into your screen? I'm trying to decide how the professor screen looks different than the student screen.
Where can we find that? I never saw it before.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Maybe that doesn't even happen on your screen. Like when you go into, I'm looking at the assignment screen, but you're not going to see everybody's assignment. So you're not going to see that. We as professors, when we go into the assignment section,
come on,
like this is week 7, the plagiarism checker automatically does a check on whatever work you submitted, just to see if there's any similarities between your work and something that the program found on the internet. But these percentages, and we were just playing, I'm going to go to yours, Melissa, since we were talking about yours yesterday. Let me see if I can, there we go. Okay, if I make that bigger. If I click on plagiarism checker, view plagiarism report, this brings up, this is week 7, so this is the work you just turned in, Melissa. I chose yours because it shows 0%. See, that said 0%. Why it gets very confusing, though, is that, you know, this program called Unicheck, it depends on how you have these settings set to know what's happening. Right now, it's saying Melissa has a 95.2% originality and 4.8 similarity. But what those similarities are is like, it's like it's putting in blue. This is a quotation that you took from these authors, and so it highlighted those in blue. So that's not really plagiarism. You've got the correct quotation marks around that. Okay, so if it's in blue, it's fine. This 4.8% is the percentage of this document that contains content that is not original with the writer. Okay, so that's what that means. If there was some content that was highlighted in yellow, well, now why is that highlighted in yellow? Let's see. No, that is highlighted in yellow because it found that on the internet. This is where Unicheck gets kind of confusing to me. It's because that's in yellow. It's still in quotation marks. So whether that's getting counted into this 4.8% or not. all that to say, this program becomes a bit confusing. And you know, we're still wrestling with it. I'm still wrestling with it. And at first I thought it was really going to be a good program, but I've had some issues. I know, Dr. Henry, you use Grammarly, which does both plagiarism checking and grammar checking. And I think you've had good success with that program, right?
No program is perfect, as it were.
Right.
So usually we have to go in and do our interpretation of what they have shared with us. The thing about, well, you remember in the beginning I did have access problems with Unicheck.
Right.
But that has since cleared up. However, I guess it's more familiarity for me at this time that I work with Grammarly.
Okay.
I think what is important for all of us is that the plagiarism checker is really helping us to properly document the use of sources.
Right.
We are expected to use sources in this kind of work. The issue is, how do we document it? And then, of course, there is the issue of style, in the sense that even in documentation, what you want to avoid is a document where you string together quotes from different sources, even though you identify the quotes.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be a what we call quote unquote smooth read. But the challenge is for us to take the resources, assimilate them, and record them in a way that reflects that we have grasped what we have read. So as much as possible, I like to encourage students to paraphrase. But when you paraphrase, of course, and summarize, you do have to give credit. You do have to acknowledge the source that you're paraphrasing. So there's the issue of style that is involved too.
Okay.
But a 95.2 originality is good.
Right.
The academic dean's office says, requires that we make sure that students don't go above, have similarity that is more than 15%.
Right.
So 95.2 originality, 4.2 similarity, that's good. That's acceptable.
Right. And what that means, say, when we talk about a similarity score of, say, 15%, that does not mean that that piece of writing has 15% plagiarism, okay? What that simply means is that 15% of that total writing is composed of quotation, some kind of quotations, and hopefully, you know, they are properly documented, okay? But so 15%, so when I look at a dissertation, I'm looking to make sure that there's a good level of originality in that it's not just, as Dr. Henry said, a series of quotations that are strung together with very little analysis, very little commentary from the student's point of view. So when we say, you know, 15% is the maximum that we're looking for in similarity, again, that's not, we're not allowing 15% plagiarism, which is, you know, putting down sentences, even phrases, without using quotation marks and giving proper credit to an author, all right? So again, in this case, Melissa, you've got a 95.2% originality, that means, you know, in this total piece right now, which is chapters 1 and 2, about 95% is your own original work, and then about 4.8 is consisting of various quotations that you have, you know, put into your paper, which is what we want, you know. So I don't know if that makes sense. You pretty me, you know, and there's settings over here. That's where it gets a little confusing. You know, right now I've got this set. Let's see. How do we see? Okay, right now this is looking at the internet. What gets confusing if I click on something called library, this is where it causes some problems. Now you've got a 41.32% originality and a 58.68 similarity. And that's this little quirky thing that I think in Unicheck. Right now, what it's doing, it's checking Melissa's paper against all the papers that are currently in the Unicheck database. Those papers include Melissa's paper because it checked that paper for you know, originality, and now it's basically checking Melissa's paper against her own paper, which totally makes no sense. The reason that's there is so that it's trying to help a person, say a professor, make sure that a student has not copied work from somebody else's paper, you know, in a class, etc. So I think that's what that library thing. But at our level, at the graduate level, for me, that's totally useless, okay? So I need to make sure I've clicked on the internet button. So now it's only checking this paper as compared to internet sources. And now it's thinking. It takes a while. And, you know, once I click on that internet source, now it's only checking Melissa's paper against internet sources. And, well, it still didn't change this back. It should go back up to 95.2% like we had before. Anyway, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. If you would like to kind of, you know, work with that plagiarism checker, I'm going to keep working with it a little more so that I can give even, you know, a better explanation of this. I'm actually talking with some of the people at Unicheck. I'm going to get together with a few of them because I just think there's a few of these issues that I think are not really helpful to us. And I'm going to talk that through with them, just to see how much more user-friendly we can make this program in our classes. All right. Let's just take a couple of minutes and talk about any questions you might have at this point. You know, about the work you've been doing or just about anything for the course. And then we're going to move into some specific issues in terms of the research methodology chapter, which you're starting this week. And if you don't have any questions, that's fine. We can move on ahead. And if you have questions along the way, that'll be fine.
Dr. Payne.
Go ahead, Melissa.
You know, in our email, I was saying that I couldn't find where to deselect the library in the report tool. And I just went now as I saw that you showed us how that looks. I'm like, oh, well, that sounds easy.
Okay.
But I just went there while you were talking and went to it. I went to the thing and logged in there like I had before. And I'm not seeing that. Maybe that's just, you know, I want to share my screen because I'm like, I'm not finding what you showed available in my system, in my screen.
Is your screen up right now?
I guess I could share it, huh?
Yeah, just share it a second. I just want to see that. Because there's also there's two interfaces for Unicheck. Right now, there's a button you can switch to the new similarity report. I have to see which report your computer is looking at.
Let's see. Can you see?
There you go.
And so if I'm down, wait, let me minimize this thing here. So if I'm scrolling down on the margin here where the options are, I've clicked on all these things experimentally, and I'm not seeing anywhere where it just lets me look at the internet, not the library.
Interesting. Okay, so you.
Okay. May I suggest that that option is, I think, for us, the professors.
Is it?
Yes.
Maybe
That's what I was
So
wondering.
that is why
Yeah.
when Dr. Payne went in and he
Okay.
changed it, and then you look at it, you can't
Yeah.
do that change back.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
your view, there are limitations to the students' views compared to the professor's views.
Okay.
And that's what started this conversation, because I emailed Dr. Payne going, it says it's 0% originality.
Right. Yeah. But see that, when it was giving you that, that's because it had checked your own paper against your own paper. When you,
I get
Mhm.
that.
of
Yeah,
course,
okay.
it should have been 100% similar because it's, okay. Yeah, those are some of the issues I'm going to try to talk through with the Unicheck people and just say, you know, we really need to have this screen. We need it to default so that you can actually look at it in relationship to internet sources only. We don't want the library included there at all. And I just want to, you know, get this, you know, because, you know, we pay for this program every month. So we need to make sure it's, you know, being useful to our students. So, yeah.
Okay, now I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing the screen.
There should be a red button at
Just
the top.
Oh,
of the
stop
button.
share. I'm
There
going
you
on.
go. Yeah, click on it. There you go.
Thank you.
All right. Well, let me share my screen one more time.
Dr. Payne,
Go ahead.
sorry, but maybe this is, excuse my naivety. So do I access Unicheck from Populi, or I've not done that yet?
Yeah, right now, yeah, Populi, the Populi company who we do all our courses through, they have an agreement with Unicheck that if we as a school pay an additional fee for Unicheck, then that becomes part of our Populi program. So when you have on your assignment page, when you are seeing, you know, a document there's a viewer window, at least that's the way, and I'm sure it looks the same way on your student screen. There's a button that says View Plagiarism Report. And when you click on that, when you have an assignment up in the assignment window, it should give you the screen that I was just showing and Melissa was just showing.
Okay.
But yeah, you'd have to just kind of experiment with that a little bit and then see if it's helpful to you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let me share my screen one more time. Okay, this is a document that you should have in this week's lessons. And I'm just going to make a few brief comments about this. As we start the research chapter, it's where you're going to talk about, you know, in a little more detail, how you're actually going to go about gathering your empirical data. Okay, and so, you know, in your template, you've got these sections. You've got the research method, you've got the sampling method, you got the data gathering strategies and analysis, and then you'll have ethical considerations, intervention strategy, evaluation methods. Okay, and then this assignment just goes with this particular week. But those are the major sections in the template for your research methodology section. So what you're doing these 2 weeks is that you are working on developing those various sections, okay? It's good to kind of, you know, start the chapter with an introductory paragraph summarizing the purpose of your project and your main research question. Then the subheadings in this instruction sheet correlate with the subheadings to be used with this chapter. So let's just talk about that first section. I'm going to just kind of give kind of a brief overview of this. I think Dr. Henry might have a few other slides that we can look at that'll get us into some other details. But, you know, the research method, you know, basically when we're talking about a method, we're talking about the quantitative approach, the qualitative approach, or a mixture of those two approaches in some format. So what you're basically doing in this section is you're just basically identifying the particular research approach that you are choosing to use, and you're going to, describe that approach a bit for your reader. You need to write this section, and you do this with a lot of your dissertation too. Sometimes we can just take for granted. So you say, well, everybody knows what a quantitative method is, so I don't really have to say much about it. No, in the dissertation writing, you don't take anything for granted, okay? You describe what a quantitative approach is, okay? I was just looking, in our textbook by Merriam. This is on page 5, okay? And it basically, it gives some definitions of qualitative and quantitative methods. So it'd be good for your reader to probably, include something of a definition or some description of that method. I'm just going to read here. This is on page 5 of the Merriam book. At this point, she's talking about the quantitative approach. Things such as surveys or quantitative descriptions are intended to systematically describe the facts and characteristics of a given phenomenon or the relationships between the events and that phenomena. And these different techniques are grouped together and called quantitative because they focus on how much or how many, and the results are usually presented in numerical form. Like we say in here, a quantitative approach could be used to determine trends, opinions, beliefs, values of people in a population. A typical approach would be to conduct a survey using closed-ended questions, true, false, multiple choice, etc. So if one part of your research, you really needed to kind of get a general sense of how a sample of a population thinks about, say, a particular problem that you may be dealing with, you could maybe do a quantitative survey trying to understand in a general way how people feel about a particular issue. Maybe, do you think, unemployment is a problem in your particular area? Yes, no. Have you ever had trouble finding employment in a particular, in your area? Yes, no. How long have you gone without employment? And you give them a multiple choice, 1 to 2 months, 2 months to 6 months, 6 months to a year, 1 to 2 years, and they'd have multiple choice. But the situation is a quantitative survey it has yes, no, true, false, and multiple choice. Those are generally the kinds of choices that you give your participants so that you can then look at that data and you can tabulate it. You can say, there's X number of yeses, X number of no's, and then you can begin to, get a general sense of how that population is feeling about unemployment, for example, in that area. Merriam goes on to say, though, and she says, rather than determining cause and effect and predicting or describing the distribution of some attribute among a population, we might be interested in uncovering the meaning of the phenomena that are involved. Qualitative researchers are interested in understanding how people interpret their experiences and how they construct their worlds. So a qualitative approach, again, like it's more down here in this page, it's more subjective than a quantitative method, and it involves a smaller sample size generally. The purpose of this approach is to provide a more in-depth understanding of people's perceptions on a situation. I may want to sit down and talk about to a person about what's been their experience with unemployment. How's that affected their life, their family? Has it caused depression? Has it, how has it generally affected them? And then they have a little more time, say in an interview setting, or we could do it in a focus group setting, to be able to talk about that experience of unemployment in more in depth. So, you know, both quantitative and qualitative methods have their place, but it's what you're trying to determine for your particular research at any given time. There again, if you use a quantitative approach, you do have to have a representative sample. And did we put it in this? Yeah, okay. Down here at the bottom under the sampling method, there's a website you can go to, a SurveyMonkey website, that you can actually enter, say, a population. Say, and population is simply just means, you know, the group that you're studying. If you're studying a community, a whole community, you know, XYZ city, then the population is going to be the population of that city. And then, say if the population of that city was 1 million, okay? In this survey, in this particular website, you could enter the population of 1 million, and then there's a couple other criteria. One is the coefficient of accuracy, and you can, like, you know, put in a 95% accuracy, and there's one other, a couple other criteria that you can look at, and it describes what each criteria means. Once you get the results, once you've put in your population and the coefficients, etc., that you want to use, you hit the button, it will give you what would be considered an adequate sample of that population if you are going to be getting a fairly representative sample of that population. Of course, then even then, when you're trying to develop a sample, there are books written and tables that could be used, random tables, depending on what kind of research you're doing, to actually design a really scientifically designed sample. You may not have to get into quite that level of sophistication. If you're going to say you're working with an organization, say there's 100 employees in that organization, that's the population that you're working with now, okay? And you could enter 100 in this particular SurveyMonkey website, and it'll give you how many people you would need to involve in your research in order to have a fairly representative sample, especially, say, for a quantitative study. So anyway, this section, you're kind of talking about the method, and then giving a rationale, we call it, why that you think this particular method is useful for answering some particular aspect of your research questions, okay? And again, a mixed method, you may choose to use both. Someone may choose to do a quantitative survey to start with to kind of get some general information, and then based on that survey, a person may decide to take a smaller group of those people and actually involve them in an interview or a focus group. So that's the research section. Method section is where you kind of talk about the method you're going to use, and then giving the rationale why you think this particular approach or approaches, if you're using a mixed method, would be useful for answering the specific kinds of research questions you are asking and needing to find information about. The sampling method section is just that. We're just talking about, what is the population that you're working with, and what size sample are you going to use as representative of that particular population. What is the size of the population? What's the size of the representative sample of the people you plan to have participate in your research? What general criteria will you use to select members for your samples, such as age, gender, socioeconomic factors, etc.? That'd all be part of the sampling section. This third section, data gathering strategies, are just that. There's certain strategies, surveys, that's a particular strategy, focus group, interviews, those are all typical strategies that could be used for analyzing data. What we've done, though, we've kind of broken this section up into three typical types of methods, questions and surveys, and giving you the kinds of questions you should be answering if you're using that. And so I want you to kind of look through that and try to answer those questions as you're thinking through this section. If you're doing one-on-one interviews, again, a series of questions that we would want you to be answering as you are developing this section. If you're going to use focus groups, and Dr. Henry has put some good handouts on focus groups. She's working on a course right now on focus groups. And so a series of questions that we'd want you to ask in relationship to that. So kind of be working with this chapter and use this instruction sheet. Ethical considerations, those are just, if you're working with what we call vulnerable populations or sensitive data, we now have to, we are answerable in the United States to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services whenever we're doing human research, okay? We've had to create what we call an institutional review board. So if you're going to be involved in working with, say, a vulnerable population, and, vulnerable populations are minors, pregnant women, people with mental or physical challenges, or socially or economically handicapped people, prison inmates, these would all be considered vulnerable populations. And if you're working with a vulnerable population, then you're required to meet certain standards. First of all, you'll have to submit your proposal when it goes to the academic cabinet. It also will have to go to our institutional review board, and we on that board will look at your proposal and make sure that you've got the right safeguards built into your research method.
Dr. Payne?
Safeguards is a consent form. Go ahead.
With my paper or research on multi-ethnic organization, that wouldn't be considered a vulnerable population, would it? Minority groups, or would it?
Go ahead, Dr. Henry.
No, that would not be a vulnerable population.
No, it wouldn't.
But
what could get you, say, the second criteria? Okay, if it's the first criteria for having to go to the institutional review board is that you're dealing with a vulnerable population. Okay, in your situation, you're working in organizations and you're kind of dealing with the whole issue of multiple ethnicity, right? If what might get into the problem would be for you would be the second issue. Let's see. Consult forms are also required when research involves sensitive issues such as financial status, religious beliefs, political beliefs, family issues. So that's the second criteria. If your surveys, interviews are going to get involved in asking people what's called sensitive questions about their financial status, about their religious beliefs, about their political beliefs, now you're also into the ethical issue of having to have a proposal submitted to our institute review board. The main criteria for either of these is that you have a consent form, okay? And we have a template for a typical consent form that you would fill out and design, and then when you submit your proposal, if we feel like your proposal on the academic cabinet, if we feel like your proposal you're talking about research that's going to meet one of these criteria, vulnerable populations or sensitive information, then we're going to ask that proposal be directed over to our institutional review board. They'll look at this. There's some things you have to fill out. There's an application form to have your proposal looked at by the institutional review board, and then there's a sample consent form that we ask you to fill out for your particular sample that you're looking at. Anyway,
Dr. Payne, may I
go ahead.
add to what you've just shared? The underlying purpose for the ethical considerations of research has to do with the concept of do no wrong to the participants of the research. And this issue comes out of a historical issue here in the US, where African American men were experimented on in terms of syphilis. And they did not know that this was what was happening. So this is a real live issue, and the underlying issue is that you should not, when you do research, your research should do no harm to anyone. And so as a result of that, what is important in research is transparency with the participants. They need to know what you are doing and why you are doing it. And then you have to have their, two things you have to have, their understanding and their consent. Because
Absolutely.
having understood what your research may be about, an individual may decide not to participate in it. And then there's the other issue is that an individual may start to participate in your research and decide halfway through or whatever, no, I can't be bothered with that. And they must have the freedom to not do it. So, and that information must be made clear to the participants. And that brings us to another issue in terms of research, especially if you're going to be doing surveys. Because of the incidence of dropout from research, you always survey more than the number of people that may be recommended via the calculator, because you always have to make room for the fact that not everybody who participate initially may complete the instrument if it's a questionnaire. In an interview, also, you must when you're doing a one-on-one interview, you have to let the participant know that they are free to decide not to participate as the interview progresses. So I just wanted you to be aware of those important constraints with respect to how we do research and how we engage people to participate in our research process.
That's very good. Thank you.
Very good.
You're welcome.
Right.
Excuse me, Dr. Payne.
Go ahead, Tammy.
Well, with what Dr. Clark just said, I wanted to ask, is it every research that will need this section, this ethical consideration section, all research topics?
Yes. The answer to that is yes.
Okay. So that means all of us have to get consent forms. And,
No, if you are interviewing,
yeah,
you have to get consent. If you are doing the focus group, which I'll talk a little bit more about that, you have to get people's consent to participate. That is for qualitative research. Definitely when you do quantitative research, I'll talk a little bit more about that, you have to do consent forms. You have to do consent forms when you're working with minors. So for example, if you're working with children, you have to get parents' consenting on their behalf. Just giving you that general information. But in all research, there has to be an understanding of the ethical component of the research. And the underlying issue here is that you must be respectful to the people who participate in your research, which means that you must give them full information about your research, what it is about, why you're doing it, etc. And then you have to be sure that your research will not do harm to any participant in the research.
So, and we have to get the consent form from BGU?
No, you create your own.
Okay,
Well, actually,
We'll give you guidelines on that. You create
like I was telling you, we do have a template that we are required to give you by Department of Health and Human Services that, you know, our school lawyer has looked at and has said, yes, all the correct information is included in this form. So we do have a template that you do need to follow. So yeah, you develop your own consent form, but it does need to, it's required to include certain types of information. And so that's why we do have a template that we will send to you if you fall into these, vulnerable population or sensitive information categories.
Okay, maybe the template should be sent to all of us, because if we have to do consent form for interviews or focus group, even though we are not focusing on vulnerable population, we need the consent form.
That is a question. We are, you're required to have a consent form if you have a vulnerable population or the sensitive information. I think it's a good idea, and you just talked about this, Dr. Henry. I think it's a good idea to have a consent form regardless if it's a vulnerable population or a sensitive information. Is that what you would be saying, Dr. Henry?
Yes, that's
Even
what
if you're not fitting into one of those categories, you really should have a consent form for a person in a focus group or interviews or surveys.
Yes, because what you're basically letting the participants know is that you respect and value their participation. So you're not making a demand on them, and you are showing them respect for as they participate in the process. Remember, do no harm. So that's important.
At least for some students, I've seen them, say there's a written survey, you can actually include that consent form right on the written survey. So a person fills that out with their survey form, even if they do it online. The whole point is, if you've got that consent form on file and later somebody decides to sue you, you at least have some written document that say, okay, here you have agreed in writing to participate in this survey. And the form would even say, I agree to allow my data to be used in XYZ research as long as my name is I remain anonymous. Okay, those are some of the kinds of wordings that you might include in a consent form. But again, that's all contained in this sample. But that would probably be a good idea for me to go ahead and just send all that information to everybody in the class. Then you'll see it. We actually didn't have a whole manual called the Policy and Procedures Manual for the Institutional Review Board. I think that's actually available online. But just for our purposes, I will go ahead and put that in our info place, and you can at least take a look at a lot of that information. I'll just upload all those into the files area of the information on the course. And then you can take a look at those: the policy manual, the consent form templates, and just a few other documents that would be related to those ethical issues.
Yeah, and Dr. Payne, the consent form, I hope it is flexible to take care of any local, like random standards or requirements as well.
Absolutely, yeah, and we always have to take that into consideration. We had, I remember one situation, a person was working with a vulnerable population and she needed to get consent forms, but even the very act of filling out a consent form and putting their name on that consent form created a danger situation for them just because of the kind of situation they were in. So we agreed to a particular way for those people to give consent without having to put their actual name on a form, for example. So there are certain kinds of situations that the very practice of filling out a consent form could cause a person to be in harm's way. So yeah, and so we do take those kinds of issues in consideration, and we talk those through with you because you're going to know your context best. Okay. All right, I'm not going to spend too much more time on this. You can kind of read through it. Dr. Henry, is there some slides you maybe would want to share just in terms of helping us to understand the research methods a little more, or anything else, focus group, just whatever else you'd like to share?
Okay, yes, let me share my screen and I will do a PowerPoint presentation of qualitative and quantitative research. I will also put the presentation in the course. Okay, we're looking at quantitative and qualitative research with respect to chapter 3, the research method. Chapter 3 is extremely important to the research. Every chapter is important, but the importance of chapter 3 involves one, the issue of your transparency, meaning that you have to report everything that you have done to get you through the process of the research. And that reporting is important both to the participants of the study and to the readers of the study, because from your reporting of your method, the reader can evaluate the quality the quality of your research results. Because if your process is weak, then your results will be weak. So that is why chapter 3 is so important in terms of transparency. In quantitative research, we usually say that chapter 3 should be written procedurally, which means that you, step by step, you indicate what you have done in the order in which you have done it. And the reason why we require the procedural reporting of your study is that we expect that somebody else should be able to take the same procedure that you have done, followed it exactly, and it is anticipated that they should get the same results. Now, that may be questioned, but in quantitative research, what is important is that somebody else should be able to replicate your study. Qualitative research, there's a little bit more wiggle room in the sense that the nature of qualitative research is of such, it is subjective, that it is not expected that you will replicate a qualitative study. Nevertheless, as in the quantitative study, you should do a step-by-step reporting of the procedure that you have used to get you to the place where you have collected the data. Some of this we've already covered, but looking at quantitative and qualitative research, and this PowerPoint comes out of the field of education. Usually when I look for presentations, I generally am biased towards the field of education because that's my field of specialization, adult education in particular. So the quantitative research is a type of educational research in which the researcher decides what to study. The qualitative research is a type of educational research in which the researcher relies on the views of the participants. Early in the course, as we have discussed, chapter 1, the questions of the study and the variables, one of the things that I've mentioned is that in quantitative research, the fundamental issue is in a quantitative research, you are measuring the relationship between variables. And that is why it's important when you're doing a quantitative study, you must have clarity as to the variables of your study. So, because that's what you're measuring the relationship between these variables. Let me jump in on some of, just reflecting on some of what. has been shared. Let me see if I could remember some of your variables, or you could remind me. I know Paula is looking at poverty alleviation using programs. Paula's study, I think, fits more into a qualitative study. If any of you could respond, do any of you think that your study is going to be a quantitative study?
Both.
Okay, is that Tammy? You tell me more, please.
Yeah, I'm thinking mine will be both.
Yes, go ahead. So which
both.
part will be quantitative? Which part will be qualitative? Remember, collecting demographic information is not quantitative. Just reminding you of that. But go ahead, Tammy.
Okay, the parts where I will be looking at transformational leadership, we'll be interviewing people who have been servant leaders in their various capacity of work, to know how they have been practicing the servant leadership model or not, how they have impacted their environment with it. So that will be qualitative. Then the aspect of looking at the results of the impact of servant leadership, especially my own part of leadership to the people, to take some questionnaire forms to know how servant leadership approaches that we have been using in the church, how it has impacted their lives. I think that area will be quantitative. So it's a mixed method I'm looking at. I don't know if I'm going to make sense.
Okay, let me make some observations in terms of what you have just said about the measure of servant leadership. Did I hear you say that the participants of the study will be servant leaders?
Yes.
Okay, my question to you then is, how will you know that they are servant leaders?
Okay, that is where the instrument of measurement comes in, or the methods to get that comes in. My strategy is that I will pass them through training on servant leadership, and after some times interview them or give them questionnaires to know the impact, how have they applied the lessons in their service to God in the church and their service in their places of work. I think that's how we know whether they are becoming, not that they're already there, they are becoming servant leaders.
Okay, can I just make some more comments? Okay, a general comment. One of the tenets of research is that there is a precision in the way we use language in research. And it goes back to the issue that I mentioned earlier in terms of the quantitative studies and the fact that you're looking at variables. Because one of the things that we do with variables, one of the first things you have to do is to define your variable. Because when you measure the variable, you're measuring it on the basis of its definition. Having said that, I'm going to say to you, Tammy, that when it comes to servant leadership, there are already instruments that measure servant leadership, so that I can take a test that I use that loosely. I could take, call it test, to show that will decide whether or not I'm a servant leader. Now, I may think that I'm a servant leader, but there are instruments that have been developed and tested for reliability and validity that can actually measure to tell you, well, yes, you're indeed a servant leader. So what I would recommend is that you would find an instrument that measures for servant leadership, and then you will use that instrument to measure to see if these individuals that you identify as servant leaders are indeed servant leaders. That would be the appropriate way to do that. Now, that measuring falls under, rightly so, the quantitative part of your study. Now, what you could do in addition to that is, on a qualitative basis, you could follow that up with interviews. Interviews of those same individuals, because what the interview does is the interview is a subjective response. And then what you do now is compare the results from the interviews to the results from the servant leadership measure. To see if there's a consistency, whether or not there's consistency, and then you take it from there in terms of discussing that. That's one approach that you can use.
Where can I get the instruments? How can I get the instruments?
You go online. Go online, put in the word servant leadership, measure instrument, and there are measures. And and this is for everybody too in terms of what you're doing. The thing about an instrument is that you don't only look at the instrument, you need to read the research behind the instrument, because the instrument is developed as a result of research that has specifically looked at the issue of servant leadership. So you want to look at the instrument, but you also want to look and understand the research behind the instrument that you are going to use. And there are a number of instruments out there that measure servant leadership. Okay?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very clear to me now.
You are welcome. Okay. What are the characteristics of each kind of research? Quantitative research asks specific and narrow questions, collects data from participants, analyzes numbers using statistics, and conducts the inquiry in an unbiased, objective manner. The qualitative study asks broad and general questions, collects data consisting largely of words, text, or images, pictures. It describes and analyzes words for themes, and it conducts the inquiry in a subjective, biased manner. Those are the basic differences between the quantitative and the qualitative research. Of course, there are other differences. What are the differences between the two in each step? Identifying a research problem. In the quantitative study, you look at trends or an explanation of variables relationship. I mentioned that earlier. For example, using Tammy's as an example, and I'm not sure if I remember rightly, this is what Tammy wants to do, but you may want to look at the relationship. Yes, I think he did mention that. You want to look at the relationship between servant leadership and discipleship. Servant leadership is one variable. Discipleship is another variable. Of course, you have to define each of those variables. And you can, well, what I've just described to Tammy is a quantitative approach to studying that relationship, because you're looking at two variables and you would use instruments. So one instrument will measure servant leadership. The other instrument will measure discipleship. That's one way to look at it. The qualitative research is an exploration in which little is known about the problem, and you want to get a detailed understanding of a central phenomenon. Anybody who would like to say whether or not your work falls under the qualitative method?
Dr. Henry, I think the only, I was looking when you were explaining before about the mixed methods and the survey followed up by interviews or focus groups. I thought, I can do that. I can create a survey and with true and false and multiple choice types of questions, and then follow that up with some more interviewing, subjective-based analysis or data collection. But then as you're talking about measuring the relationship between variables, I'm feeling like I don't have specific variables that I can identify that I'm measuring the relationship between. So should I just throw out any quantitative thing out completely?
I wouldn't necessarily say at this point you should throw out anything. What I would say is go back to your chapter 1, where you've identified your purpose, and see if indeed it may be that there are variables that you need to isolate to measure. And so that would be the quantitative aspect of your study. No, and in response to what you said about I can develop my own instrument, I just want to remind us that instrument development is a skill that we have not taught you. You can teach yourself, but it is a skill. And what we do, the first thing we do in research is we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So if you're clear about what you want to measure, taking us back again to the variable, then you go online and look to see what instruments are out there that have been used to measure that variable, and see which one of those instruments you may use. And there is a procedure involved in that. You have to get permission. You usually have to get permission from the owner or the creator of the instrument to use his or her instrument. And researchers are very happy to do that, because the more your instrument has been used, the more it's being tested and validated by others, the better for you. There are, however, some instruments that are in what we call the public domain. They've been out there a long time, people use them. So, but whatever instrument you use in your reporting, you have to say what is the source of the instrument, and you have to be able to say whether or not you got permission to use the instrument. Even if it's in the public domain, then you have to say it's in the public domain, so you've used it freely. I have answered more than you asked, and I hope I haven't confused you.
Well, my other question is, too, is Dr. Payne was speaking in terms of the population and the coefficient and making sure you have a representative sample. If you're doing something like women, I mean, how do you find a measurable population where you can actually get that coefficient or whatever, especially if you're dealing with a female population that doesn't have access to technology? So you can't just do, send everybody a link to fill out a survey.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good question. And that's where the whole issue of narrowing down your study and the context and the population becomes important. So yes, you are studying women, but you are not studying all women. And you're certainly not studying all women in the geographical context that you plan to look at. So what you want to do is, as much as possible, narrow your context, because then that will give you a handle in terms of your population. So let's say I decided to study women in my location in New York City. 8 million people know. In my neighborhood, yes, that's a smaller geographical location. And that's what you do. You make sure that you identify your context clearly, because that will impact the size of your sample. So you're never going to have a study that just says women. You are going to have to identify geographical location, or you might say, let's say you're looking at a study of women in higher education in a certain geographical location. That helps you to narrow down your numbers. Or you may look at women who are, let's say they're farmers in X geographical location. That certainly will narrow down your number. So it will never be just women. I hope that helps you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Henry, I was just going to state that I intend to do qualitative research. So I intend to interview a number of people who are particularly leaders in organizations that have been wrestling with this issue of multi-ethnic organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And then possibly doing a focus group. So that's where I'm leaning towards the qualitative side.
Sure. That makes sense. Certainly that makes sense, Kevin. Good. Anybody else?
I have a question. Well, first I was thinking to have the quality part with one-on-one plus focus group. And after that, I wanted to do a quantitative with this data, but I think it's too much, and I will.
I'm glad you got the revelation, because you want to complete. You do.
Yes.
Yes. So you may just do the qualitative, and after you've graduated, you could do a follow-up quantitative study, and then you don't have anybody on your back to complete it. Okay. Good.
But my second question is, we are about to start an income generation program in this land that I'm involved. And it's next month. So could I use this as an experiment as well, or it's too much?
Oh, an experiment is a different kind of study.
Okay.
So, yes, you probably could, but I would not necessarily advise that. However, I think what you're saying, and I like your thinking there, is that there may be something from that income generation project that you are developing that may be useful to your qualitative study. Yes, and that makes sense. There may be something useful. I can't say exactly what it is right now. You would know better than I do what you're doing, but there may be something useful there. It may be, for example, that in terms of the qualitative study, your sample comes from the group of persons or individuals who will be participating in this income generation project. You see what I'm saying? So then that, your income generation project would be used to help you to define the sample of your study.
Or I also could have like two focus group, one with people that are already including in an income generation project, and another one with people that maybe could be included but didn't start. Can I do that?
That's good thinking. Yes, that's possible. Good. Okay, let's move on. If you have other questions, feel free to put it in the discussion, etc. So in this section, what the presenter is doing is identifying the various subsections of the research and showing the difference between the quantitative and the qualitative method. So in terms of the review of the literature, the major role of the is through this suggesting the research questions to be asked. In looking, when you're doing a quantitative study, your review of the literature will focus on the questions of your study and also focus on the variables of your study. That's very important because you want to justify the research problem and the need for the direction of the study. So that's what happens in terms of the meaning and the significance of your chapter 2 with regards to quantitative research. In the qualitative research, the review of literature is not as significant. Not that it isn't, it's not as this significant. However, as in the quantitative research, the purpose of the review of the literature is to justify the importance of the study. It's not, there's not a major, as much of a major role when it comes to your research questions, but it certainly is used. The review of literature must be used to justify the importance of the study that you propose to do. Okay. The specifying of the purpose of the research, the quantitative research is a much narrower approach to research than the qualitative research. The qualitative research is broader, it's subjective, and on a practical level, it is more demanding than the quantitative study. Much more demanding. Not to discourage you, but just to have you be aware. Okay? Data collection. Again, you use instruments that have preset questions and responses, and you collect info from a large number of individuals. In terms of comparison, the quantitative study demands a larger sample than the qualitative study. You could have a qualitative study with 10 people. That is acceptable in a qualitative study. 10 people is way too small a number for a quantitative research. There are going to be some problems there in terms of statistical analysis. Not impossible. If 10 is your population, it's possible for you to narrow your study in such a way that 10 really is your population. That's a small number statistically, but that may happen. Analyzing and interpreting data, well, the quantitative research, statistical analysis, no getting around that. The qualitative research, the focus is on looking for themes. And you're looking for themes because you want to get to the meaning of your findings. So what are the major themes in terms of people's response from the interview, people's response in the focus group? And then now, when you look at what are the major themes, you will look at what are the relationships between these themes. I must also say to you that there are computer-generated ways to describe and assess the themes in qualitative research. So there is, I think the Merriam text has a list of software that you could use to evaluate the responses that you get from interviews, focus group, etc. Just making you aware of that. Reporting and evaluating the research. The quantitative research tends to use a standard fixed structure and evaluation criteria, and it takes an unbiased and objective approach. Remember, I'm going to put this in the course for you, and you can always print out the entire presentation. The qualitative research is more flexible in terms of identifying the emergent structure and evaluative criteria. It takes a subjective and biased approach. Okay, in terms of time, I'm going to stop here. You will see the rest of the PowerPoint, but the purpose of this presentation is to get you to start thinking research method. Remember, in research, you have to report what you have done and why you have done what you have done. In chapter 3, you must follow the guidelines that we've given you in terms of the handout and make sure you've covered all those sections. For example, if you're going to use focus group, and this segues me into a very quick reference to focus group, I've put in 2 handouts that would help you. If you're going to use focus group, you have to identify who are the participants that you selected. Tell us why you selected those participants. And then you follow the general procedure in terms of getting consent, etc. If you're going to do one-on-one interviews, same thing. Who did you select for the interviews? Why did you select those individuals? And of course, how many? When it comes to the focus group, it's recommended that you have between 8 to 12 people in the focus group. Remember, the focus group is a kind of, it is an interview, but it's a group interview. So there's a different dynamic as to what happens in a one-on-one interview. In one sense, we could say the focus group is a more powerful way of interviewing. Doesn't mean that the one-on-one interview is not important too. They both have their place. The focus group has to be directed by a moderator. So if you're going to be having focus group, I would recommend that you yourself be the moderator, and then you will look at the instructions in terms of, as moderator, what do you do? You may have somebody who is an observer. You be the moderator, but you have somebody who's an observer. And at the end of the focus group presentation, the 2 of you could meet to share, your response. Of course, you have to record the focus group, because you have to be able to transcribe that information to make sense and meaning out of it. So you are going to need a moderator for your focus group. And you also have to have questions, prepared questions. You don't just go in there and throw out a question and have a conversation. You have to have questions to guide the discussion process. So and you have to identify those questions in chapter 3. Usually what you do is give a set of sample questions, and then in the appendix, you have the full list of questions that you would have asked in the focus group.
Let me ask you a question at that point, Dr. Henry.
Sure.
I think you've had probably more experience with me in a lot of standardized instruments that you talk about. I mean, I've used things like, Myers-Briggs in psychological counseling, style of leadership inventories, etc. I guess I need to get clarification for myself and then for the students in terms of when you say it's really best to find a standard instrument. Now, I'm thinking when you say that, you are meaning, say, if you're going to do a quantitative survey and you can go online and find inner servant leadership surveys. Mm-hmm. There are going to be some standard, and there's you can find a lot of different survey instruments for, checking out styles of leadership, etc.
Sure.
But now, if we're looking, say, at a focus group and interview, especially at a qualitative level, I'm not sure that we're going to be using a standardized instruments in those kinds of cases. I mean, we're asking the student to develop some questions.
Yes.
They could possibly go look at some instruments to be able to look at the kinds of questions that maybe help them get at certain topics. Could you maybe just talk about that distinction in terms of when those standardized instruments would be helpful to use?
You're right. With the quantitative study, that's where you need to use the standardized instrument. With a qualitative study, you will create your questions, but you don't create it out of a vacuum. Your questions are related to the purpose of your study and the questions of your study, right? So but you create them yourself.
Right.
It is possible too that you could find some standardized focus group questions that you may modify to your context and situation. That is also possible. Again, if you are going to do that, you just have to report that you did use questions from somebody else's discussion and you may have modified them.
Good.
So you're right.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think that clarification need to be made.
Okay. Any other question? We are soon out of time, but I hope this has helped you, and everything will be in the course so that you could review it. Just to say again, chapter 3 is very demanding. Every chapter is demanding, but chapter 3, you have to go it over with a fine-tooth comb and just make sure you have everything. We will do that for you when we get your chapter 3, but just letting you know, it takes time.
Are we expected to turn a portion of that chapter in by Sunday?
No.
No.
This time, just take the full 2 weeks and just keep working on that chapter. By the end of next week, I guess it would be, go ahead and turn that in by Sunday, and then we can give you input, feedback.
Yes. Okay. Any other question, observation?
So just to clarify, then nothing is due this week, Dr. Payne?
Nothing from a written assignment. You just need
Okay.
to, work on your discussion.
Okay, got it.
Melissa asked one question in the chat room, what's the name of a program with a list of software for focus group questions? Is a good way from your perspective, Dr. Henry, in terms of looking up on the internet, standard questions, standard surveys, basically, say Melissa's working on, she's working in, say, some African communities trying to help women learn how to develop their transformational leadership abilities, based on, their own agency, efficacy, etc. Now, if she was working with, there's going to be thousands of questionnaires and typical things on the internet. I think that she could find that would just maybe include typical questions or topics that you might include, say, in a focus group or an interview. Say for her situation, what would be the best way for her to even find some instruments to even get an idea of some of those kinds of questions that people have asked in relationship to, say, empowering women in leadership roles?
The best way would be through the research literature. So
Okay.
what you would do is read research on empowering women,
Mm-hmm.
In those research, they are going to mention what instrument, they're going to tell you their methodology.
Okay.
So look at that and do the detective work to find what, in a good research report, they should list the questions that were asked if they use focus group.
Mm-hmm.
So that is where I would start.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's why the literature is so important.
Sure.
To even begin to know how to even ask questions, you need to have done a fair amount of reading.
Yes.
In your topical area, which is
yes.
hopefully what you've been trying to do for the last few weeks, that you're becoming familiar with the topic so that you can even ask the kinds of questions that need to be asked to get at the information you're trying
sure.
to find.
Let me just find my text with regards to what I said about the software for focus groups.
That would be helpful, yeah. Or you could upload it to the class if you wanted to. That would be very helpful.
Okay. It's in the Merriam book, Qualitative Research, and it's on page 225. And of course, there's much more than here. On page 225, she has a list, 225, table 8.1, the computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software.
Okay.
And that's a very brief list. There's just a lot more. If you just go online and Google computer-assisted data analysis software for qualitative study, you see there's just a long list. But Merriam, page 225, table 8.1.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. That at least introduce you to at least some of the instruments that are there. And like we've said, if you're doing a qualitative study, you're not necessarily going to use one of those instruments, but they may even help you understand a little more of the process of getting at the information that you would like.
Yes, that's for data analysis, yes. Anybody else? Okay.
All right, good. I've got 9:30 my time, so we'll probably need to go ahead and close down at this point. You'll have discussions group this week. Next week, you won't have a discussion group. You will have a written assignment. We will go ahead and have a last Zoom room next week. It'll be just a time for you to ask any questions. If there's any other topics that Dr. Henry and I think maybe should be brought up, we'll go ahead and do that at that time. So let's have one more Zoom room next week. Right now, just keep working on your research methodology chapter and turn that in by the end of next week. Okay. All right. Thank you for joining us and making the time today. And again, we just pray that God keeps giving us all wisdom in some of these efforts. We're all trying to learn to become good researchers in order to do what God has called us to do in the various parts of the world where we're living. So with that, I'm going to end the meeting and say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.